Today we're going to be talking about a quilting technique. I know you've all seen those beautiful Dresden plates before, and they're very easy to make even though they're visually impressive and they look so difficult, but they're actually quite easy. A friend of mine had asked me how to do the circle in the center to cover that up in order to finish her Dresden plate. So I wanted to show 3 different techniques you can use in order to make that circle in the center. Now I'm going to use a brightly colored center circle so it will be easy to see against this background of purple and black. The first method involves cutting out a circle that is slightly larger than your center opening. This is a 3-inch opening, so I cut my circle to be 3 1/4 inch, so I have the overlap that I need. The way that I did that was I used this simple protractor in order to cut out my circle at 3 1/4 inch. There are templates for it as well. That was what I had on hand and it was easy for me. By doing this 3 1/4 inch, I have an overlap of 1/4 inch. What I would do on this technique is I would pin this so it stays in place for me and I don't have it falling off of one of the edges. We'll pin this in a few places and we'll take this to the sewing machine. And I can feel with my finger underneath that I'm about 1/4 inch overlapping. There we go. So now I'm going to put this on the sewing machine, and what I'm going to do is sew about 1/8 inch in. And I'm going to leave a raw edge. And then that way, as the quilt gets washed over time, it will produce this frayed edge and it will give texture to the quilt. So let's put this here onto the machine. And I'm going to do only about 1/8 of an inch, just enough to catch that, but enough to leave a raw edge there. Let's see if I can find, there we go. Now you may have noticed that I did not backstitch in the beginning. When I come all the way around, I will backstitch then and it will lock all of it down in place. I don't want to make too much backstitching in one area by starting off with backstitching and ending with it, because it will create a very thick amount of stitching in one area and I want to keep it to a minimum. So I will do my backstitching when I come all the way back around again and meet the end, and then I can catch those first few stitches and be able to lock over them. I'll see you when we're done with this circle. Okay, so as you can see, I've gone about 1/8 inch just on the inside, just enough to be able to catch the circle and the overlapping fabric beneath it. And I have made a very small amount of backstitching there just to catch the beginning and end together so that it doesn't create too much thickness. And when we look at the back of this, you can see how it has caught the fabric just fine. But it allows us to have that raw edge, so every time you wash the quilt, you'll get a fluffier and fluffier fray around the edge, and it adds for an interesting visual element to your quilt. So let's talk about technique number 2. Technique number 2 involves a slightly larger circle, a piece of paper, and a glue stick. On the previous technique, we had cut out our circle to be 3 1/4 inch. We cut this one to be 3 1/2 inches, and the interior paper circle is 3 1/4 inch. What I would do here is use my glue stick, go around the edge, and then I'm going to fold over the fabric. at which point I will then iron and make sure that it stays in place in order to create the circle that I want. So I'm going to glue this down and we'll be right back. So now I have glued the edges down and I have a perfect circle. I will iron this in order to make sure my edges are nice and sharp and tight. And now I will remove the paper so that I can sew this into the center of the Dresden. So now I have removed the paper from the back. It is well ironed with nice tight edges. And just like technique number 1, we are going to place this, center it, so that we can feel with our fingers that we are overlapping the fabric, and then we will sew this into place. One of the things you can do instead of using your sewing machine is you can actually hand sew this. You can even applique this, which would give a really nice edge because all your applique stitches would be hidden along the very, very tight, sharp edge and you wouldn't see them. And it gives a really nice finish. If you want to hand stitch by doing a running stitch right along the edge, or a straight stitch right along the edge, that will also do a very good job as long as you've got enough of an overlap so that you have your center circle well over the fabric so you catch all of it. And you don't end up having the edge of your circle accidentally too close or even inside the opening of the center of your Dresden plate. There we go. Let's get one more in here to really hold this down in place. This is also an opportunity for you to be able to use some of the decorative stitches on your machine. If you were to do a decorative stitch around the edge of your circle, you could add even more visual interest to your Dresden plate. I'm going to use just a straight stitch for the purposes of demonstration. And I'm using a darker thread just so that you can easily see what I'm doing. And just like technique number 1, we're only sewing about 1/8 inch or even less just on the inside of the circle, just enough to be able to catch it. And again, like technique 1, I'm only going to backstitch when I reach all the way back around again. I'm not going to do it in the beginning. And this is what technique 2 looks like when it's finished. I have come in a little bit closer on the edges, but you can even get closer to the far edge if you would like. Technique number 3 involves your center circle and the same size fusible interfacing. That's the kind that has the bumpy on one side and smooth on the other, so that when you iron it, it will stick to the other side because the bumpy side is little tiny glue dots. And I'll show you about that in a moment. This technique is often used for a Dresden plate that has already been stitched onto a backing fabric. This is going to end up being a wall hanging. So I'm going to show you how I've done this. In order to find where my center was, I folded my fabric in both directions and I ironed it to get my lines there. Then when I open it, I can lay my Dresden on it and I can either match up the ironed lines and a seam, or I can do the ironed lines and a point. I think I'm going to do a point. So I'm getting my points lined up in one direction, and now I need to line up my points over here. And that tells me if I am in the right place, if I truly have this centered. All right, there we go. Now what we do is we're going to pin this onto our fabric. And we're going to sew around the top edge where we have the points of our Dresdens. Let's get one more pin in there so that we hold this in place. I want to make sure that we've got our lines lined up. Okay, good. That means that we've got a center very well placed here. Now on the back of this Dresden, you can see that the edges of the fabric actually come down below where the point is, where the lowest valley is, where each one of the fabrics meet. So this goes below. So if we were to do a stitch line just barely below the points, or even along these points right here where it comes down into a valley, we would be able to catch the fabric on the back so that it wouldn't end up coming up later on and showing. It would be well secured. So that's what we're going to do right now. We're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to sew all the way around, and we're going to go from one valley to another, to another, to another. And when we come back, you'll see how this is finished. And I'm going to use a purple thread so that you can easily see where I have stitched. So now we've stitched all the way around in order to secure this to our background fabric. And you can see when I pull up, we have secured the fabric just fine. There is no raw edge sticking out, so that is nicely secured. And by having your points exposed like this and not sewn down, it adds, again, more texture and visual interest to this. So what we'll do with our center circle now is we are going to put the right side with the bumpy side facing it. We are going to stitch all the way around here, anywhere from 1/8 inch to 1/4 inch, at which point we're going to end up turning this right side out. So now I've snipped it, and you're going to see in a moment why I've put that little snip there. I didn't cut all the way through, I just put a little bit of a snip there so I'd have some opening, okay? Now, we're going to move that to the side, bring our sewing machine forward, and we're gonna stitch around this. And I will be back in a moment when this has been stitched. Okay, as you can see, I have stitched all the way around. I have that snip there so I can turn this right side out. And I want the bumpy side to be facing out because we can use that to fuse this into place and make it easier for sewing. Now, one of the handy tools you can use for this, some people have this called the purple thing, and you can use that to push out your edges and to make your circle nice and round. Do not iron this until you've got it in place. Don't iron it in an attempt to try and get your edges to be nice and sharp and tight. Use this or a chopstick or the end of a crochet hook or something that will allow you to be able to push out those edges. So see how perfectly that works? Now, let's get our Dresden back out here. You can center this, and another way you can make sure that your center is correct is finger press in half, turn 1/4, and do the other half. And again, now that you've got a plus sign here, line it up. There we go. Make sure that we've got this all lined up. Now, because these circles were originally 3.5 inches, and when we sewed them with about 3/8 or 1/8 of an inch, we have plenty of overlap here. When we go to iron this, it will fuse it down in place for us, at which point we can then go around and do a decorative stitch or a straight stitch, or leave it without any stitching at all, and it will be fine. If you're planning to come along and do quilting, if you're making this into a block, even as a wall hanging, this would be quilted. And the stitching from the quilting will help to hold it down as well. So you can choose to either go ahead and do a stitch, straight stitch, decorative stitch. You can even hand stitch it or applique it down, or after you've ironed it, you can just simply leave it as is and not stitch it at all, because it will be holding itself down. So let's iron this down, and then let's talk about our Dresden. So now I've ironed this down, and you see it stays just fine because it is fused onto there, and it's actually flattened out. It was a little puffy before, but now it's flattened out and it stays down very nicely. So now I can go ahead and sandwich this with my batting and my backing. I can quilt it, add my binding, and then this will be a beautiful wall hanging. So don't be afraid of trying to do a Dresden plate. They're actually a lot simpler than they look. The visual impressiveness of it is the whole point, to make it look really impressive
and hard.
But it was actually easy to achieve. And now you know 3 different techniques for being able to do your center circle. So thanks for joining me today. I'll see you next time.